I sat at my desk in the small but cozy office in the heart of New York City, eyes scanning through the reports of the investment firm where I worked. My fingers felt stiff as they moved across the paper, but my mind was elsewhere. A storm raged inside me, one I couldn't control. The city outside hummed with its usual chaotic energy, but all I could hear was the distant sound of Jason's footsteps. He was new in the team, but already he'd proven himself ambitious and confident. In a way, he was everything I wished my husband, Jonathan, could be. Jason was open, straightforward. There was nothing hidden in him, nothing I had to decode. He was just there. And that was so different from Jonathan. With him, it always felt like there was a wall between us, a wall I couldn't break through. He didn't see me the way Jason did. He didn't see the signs I was beginning to notice in myself. I felt this urge to talk to Jason, to tell him everything that was spinning inside me. But I couldn't. I was stuck in a quiet prison I'd built for myself, torn between the life I had and the life I secretly longed for. My phone buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a message from Jason, just the usual, a quick work update, but I couldn't ignore the underlying tone. It was almost like an invitation. I stared at the message, unable to bring myself to reply. Was I crossing a line? Was I already too far gone? The thoughts flooded my mind, and I couldn't stop them. All I wanted was to reply, to connect with him, but I couldn't. I couldn't let myself. I looked down at my hands, willing them to stop shaking. But they wouldn't. It was already too late. Jason entered the office just as I was about to bury my thoughts in another stack of papers. He paused by the door, looking at me in a way that made my breath catch in my throat. His gaze wasn't the kind I was used to. It wasn't the casual glance of a colleague or the professional look of someone you had to impress. It was more. I could see the spark in his eyes, that unspoken curiosity. He was studying me, and I wasn't sure whether I wanted him to stop or lean in closer. "You didn't reply to my message," he said, his voice low and almost teasing. His tone was casual, but there was something in it. Something that made me feel like he was challenging me, daring me to break the silence between us. My heart skipped a beat, and I forced myself to focus on his words. "I didn't see it," I said, trying to sound nonchalant, but I knew my voice betrayed me. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, a warmth that had nothing to do with the room temperature. Jason raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. I see." He leaned against the doorframe, his eyes never leaving mine. It was as though he could see right through me, like he understood the storm brewing beneath the surface. We started talking about work, but it was different now. I wasn't paying attention to the figures in the report or the numbers on the screen. I was acutely aware of every shift in his posture, every word that left his mouth. The way his voice seemed to dip just a little when he spoke to me. The way his hand brushed against mine as he handed me a document, sending a jolt of electricity up my arm. I was trying so hard to focus on the task at hand, but it felt like I was drowning in his presence. Every glance, every subtle movement was pulling me deeper into something I didn't want to face, something I wasn't ready for. But it was already happening, and I couldn't stop it. As we talked, the air between us seemed to thicken, like an invisible thread connecting us. I couldn't think straight anymore. The professional boundary we once had was slipping away, and I didn't know how to hold on. And in that moment, as our eyes met once again, I realized I didn't want to. About an hour later, the door to my office opened again, this time with a soft creak. It was Jonathan, my husband. I had nearly forgotten he worked at the same company, but there he was, standing in the doorway with his usual thoughtful smile. He looked like he hadn't a care in the world. He always knew how to make everything seem so easy, so comfortable. I wanted to feel that comfort, but instead, I felt a wall inside me growing higher with each passing second. "How's everything going?" Jonathan asked, stepping into the room. He placed his hand on my shoulders, a familiar gesture, one that used to bring a sense of calm to my racing mind. But now it was hollow. His touch was empty, like a reminder of how far we'd drifted apart. The sensation made my skin prickle and I tried not to recoil. "Everything's fine," I replied, forcing a smile I didn't feel. I couldn't look at him the way I used to. He didn't seem to notice, or maybe he was too caught up in his own world to sense the subtle shift in me. I felt his fingers linger for a moment, but instead of the warmth that used to spread through me when he touched me, there was only a cold void. My thoughts, which had been so tangled with Jason just moments before, rushed back in. The feeling of his eyes on me, the pulse of electricity when our hands briefly touched, it was all I could think about now. How could I explain that to Jonathan? How could I explain what I was feeling when I didn't even understand it myself? Jonathan gave me a quick kiss on the forehead before turning to leave, completely unaware of the storm that was silently brewing inside me. "Let's grab dinner later?" he asked, his voice light, oblivious. I nodded absently, but my mind was elsewhere. I didn't feel like the woman he thought he married, the woman I once was. I felt like a stranger to him, and worse, a stranger to myself. Once the door closed behind Jonathan, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I stared at the empty space he'd left behind, the silence pressing in on me. I couldn't stay in this life anymore. I could feel the invisible line that divided my old life from this new, dangerous longing, and I knew deep down that I couldn't ignore it for much longer. Something inside me had already crossed over, and it wasn't just a question of whether I could go back. It was whether I even wanted to. The next day, as I walked into the office, I tried to convince myself that everything would go back to normal, that I could simply focus on work, block out the thoughts of Jason, and bury my emotions where they couldn't reach me. But the moment I stepped into the room, I knew I was lying to myself. Jason was already there, seated at his desk, preparing for an important presentation. His back was to me, but I could feel his presence like a weight in the room. I tried to act like nothing had changed, like I wasn't constantly aware of every movement he made, every breath he took. But my eyes kept drifting toward him, unable to resist the pull. He didn't even have to look at me for my heart to race. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, the familiar, dangerous flutter in my stomach. His energy was magnetic, and I couldn't deny it any longer. I was supposed to be focused on the reports, supposed to be doing my job. But with every passing minute, the barrier between professional and personal continued to erode. I was lost in a fog of desire and guilt, all tangled together. When Jason finally turned to face me, his eyes locked with mine. For a moment, everything else disappeared. It was just the two of us, standing there in the middle of the office, everything else becoming a distant hum in the background. The connection between us was so palpable, so charged, that I felt my body react before I could think. Without a word, he stood up and walked toward me, his steps deliberate. My breath caught in my throat as he closed the space between us. There was no need for pleasantries, no small talk. He didn't need to say anything for me to know what he was thinking. I could see it in the intensity of his gaze. In that moment, my heart raced, and my mind screamed at me to stop, to push him away. But I didn't. I couldn't. Something inside me had already given in, and it was too late to take it back. Jason's hand brushed mine as he handed me a folder. The contact was brief, but it felt like an electric shock that reverberated through my entire body. I froze, unable to move, as the world around us seemed to fall away. "You feel that, don't you?" he whispered, his voice low and filled with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. My body was betraying me, my heart pounding in my chest. I nodded, barely able to breathe, and then, before I could even process it, he leaned in slightly, his lips hovering near my ear. "We can't ignore this," he murmured. "Not anymore." I wanted to push him away. I wanted to scream that I couldn't do this, that I was married, that I had a life. But the truth was, I didn't want to. I didn't know how to fight the craving for him, the pull that seemed to take over every fiber of my being. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that stepping forward would be a mistake, but not being able to resist the temptation to fall. The moment stretched on, endless and impossible, until I finally managed to pull myself together. I backed away, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. "We should get back to work," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, hoping it would sound more like a command than a plea. But as I walked away, I could feel him watching me, and I knew, with a terrifying clarity, that I had already crossed a line. There was no going back. The days that followed felt like a blur. My life, which had once been so structured and predictable, now felt like it was spinning out of control. I threw myself into work, but even that couldn't escape the pull Jason had on me. I could hardly focus on anything. Each glance, each word, each accidental touch between us made my mind swirl. The lines between professional decorum and personal temptation had long since blurred, and there was no telling where one began and the other ended. I thought I could control it, that I could compartmentalize the growing feelings inside me and push them aside, but I couldn't. Every moment with Jason felt like an addiction, a high I knew I couldn't sustain. He was always there, always close, and the air around him felt charged, electric. The worst part was that I couldn't hide it from myself anymore. I felt it every time Jonathan came home, the tension, the distance. Every hug from him, every kiss on the cheek felt empty, like a gesture I had learned to perform rather than something I truly wanted. The guilt gnawed at me, but I couldn't escape the growing need to be near Jason. That night, we had a corporate event. I'd hoped the distraction of being surrounded by colleagues and clients would help me keep my distance from Jason, but it only made it worse. He was there, across the room, his eyes never straying far from me. I could feel the heat of his gaze like a fire against my skin, even from a distance. Jonathan was by my side, talking about the latest deal, his voice calm and steady, as always. But I wasn't listening. I was watching Jason, watching the way he moved through the room, the way he spoke to people with that ease that made him so magnetic. Every few moments, his eyes would find mine, and in those brief seconds, everything else would fade away. Finally, after what felt like hours of silent torment, Jason approached. He didn't speak, just leaned in close, his lips brushing my ear as he whispered, "You can't keep pretending, can you?" I stiffened, my heart racing. Jonathan was standing beside me, completely unaware of the conversation happening right next to him, but I could feel the weight of Jason's words, and they settled deep within me, making me tremble. "You're not even trying to hide it anymore," Jason continued, his breath warm against my skin. "You feel it too, and I know you want this." His words were a challenge, an invitation, and I couldn't deny that every part of me wanted to take him up on it. But I couldn't. Not here. Not now. I turned my head slightly to look at Jonathan, forcing myself to smile. "I need a moment," I said softly, my voice shaky. Jonathan gave me a puzzled look but nodded. As soon as I stepped away from him, Jason followed. We slipped out of the main hall and into a quiet corridor. The silence between us was deafening, heavy with unspoken words and unresolved tension. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, the electricity between us thickening with every step. "I can't stop thinking about you," Jason said, his voice raw. There was no pretense, no game, just the honesty of someone who knew exactly what they wanted. I didn't know how to respond. Everything inside me screamed at me to walk away, to go back to the life I knew, to fix what had been broken with Jonathan. But my heart, my body, was telling me something else. It was telling me that I couldn't resist this, couldn't turn away from it. And in that moment, I knew. Whatever happened next, there was no going back. The next few days felt like a rush, a headlong dive into something I couldn't control. I tried to force myself back into the normal routine, back to pretending, back to the person I used to be. But nothing felt normal anymore. Not after the corridor, not after hearing Jason's words, not after the way my body had responded to him. I couldn't forget it. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Jason and I continued to share the office space, but now every interaction felt loaded. Every word, every glance felt like a magnetic pull that I couldn't escape. It was a game now. One I didn't want to play but couldn't stop. The tension between us was unbearable, like a pressure building up inside me that had no way to release. And then, it happened. It was a Tuesday afternoon when everything came to a head. Jason and I were alone in the conference room, preparing for a client meeting. The usual professional distance had evaporated, replaced with something raw, something undeniable. The air was thick with unspoken words, and I could hardly breathe. My hands shook as I flipped through the presentation slides, but my mind was elsewhere, on him. I could feel Jason's presence behind me, his eyes on my every move. I turned around to face him, just as he stepped closer. "I can't keep pretending," he whispered, his voice low and husky. His breath brushed against my skin, and I felt my body betray me once again. "I don't want to." Before I could even process what was happening, he was in front of me, his lips on mine. It was sudden, urgent, as if both of us had been holding our breath for far too long. My mind screamed at me to pull away, to stop, to remember everything I had, but my body wouldn't listen. My hands found his chest, pulling him closer, and it was like the world had vanished. There was only the heat of his touch, the intensity of the kiss, and the overwhelming desire I could no longer deny. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, the sound of it pulsing through my entire being. My world had narrowed down to this one moment, and nothing else seemed to matter. Not the consequences, not Jonathan, not anything. But then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. Jason pulled away, his breath ragged, his eyes dark with something I couldn't quite name. He looked at me, waiting for a reaction, for something, but I couldn't give it to him. I was paralyzed, caught in the whirlwind of emotions, the guilt, the desire. My thoughts felt like a tornado spinning out of control. "I don't know what to do," I said, my voice trembling. I couldn't even look at him. I couldn't look at myself. Jason took a step back, his expression softening. "You don't have to decide now," he said quietly, "but you know what you want. And so do I." His words hit me like a sledgehammer. I did know. But I didn't know how to reconcile it with the life I had. I turned away, my eyes blurring with unshed tears. How had I gotten here? How had I allowed myself to fall this far? And what would happen now? What would happen to Jonathan? To me? The storm inside me wasn't going to end. It was only just beginning. The days that followed felt like a prison, each one dragging me deeper into the mess I had created. The weight of my choices was suffocating. I was living in two worlds, the one with Jonathan, the life I had built with him, and the one with Jason, where nothing felt real, but everything felt alive in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Every time I saw Jonathan, I felt the weight of my secret pressing down on me. I couldn't look him in the eyes without feeling the guilt gnawing at me. His gentle smile, the way he asked about my day, the way he still cared, all of it only served to make me feel more like a fraud. How could I look at him and pretend everything was fine when I was falling for someone else? I couldn't keep doing this. I couldn't keep pretending. One night, after we had finished dinner and were sitting at the table, I knew the moment had arrived. Jonathan was sipping his wine, scrolling through his phone, completely unaware of the turmoil inside me. I stared at him, my heart aching. He deserved more than this. He deserved the truth. "I need to tell you something," I said, my voice tight. The words were stuck in my throat, but they had to come out. I couldn't carry this secret any longer. Jonathan looked up at me, confused. "What's wrong?" I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. The fear was overwhelming, paralyzing. How could I possibly explain this? How could I tell him the truth when it felt like I was ripping our entire life apart? He set his phone down and leaned forward, concern creeping into his eyes. "What is it? You're scaring me." I took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of courage I had left. "There's someone else," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Jonathan's face went pale, and I could see the shock in his eyes as he tried to process what I had just said. "What?" His voice was barely a whisper, disbelief etched across his face. "What do you mean?" "I'm sorry," I said, my voice cracking. "I never wanted this to happen, but it has. There's someone else, Jonathan. Someone I care about. I couldn't bring myself to say it outright. I couldn't bring myself to say his name. Jonathan stared at me, his face an unreadable mask. He didn't speak for a long moment, and I could feel the weight of his silence pressing in on me. Finally, he looked away, his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance. "I didn't see this coming," he murmured, almost to himself. I never thought you'd do this." I wanted to apologize, to explain everything, but the words caught in my throat. What could I say? How could I make him understand when I didn't understand myself? "Is it him?" Jonathan asked quietly, his voice strained. I could hear the hurt in his words, and it tore at me. I nodded, too afraid to speak, too afraid to break down in front of him. The tears started to fall, but I didn't try to stop them. I had already done the damage. "I don't know how it happened," I said, my voice barely audible. "I didn't plan for any of this, but I can't ignore what I feel anymore."